Ladies and gentlemen, in this Red Gaming Tedicom video, I'm pretty sure that most of you would have heard the issues regarding the Xbox One's resolution by now. Of course, Call of Duty Ghosts was just one title among many which couldn't quite hit the 1080p mark. Indeed, it went to 720p and 60 frames a second. Mark Rubin from Infinity Ward has been answering some questions and discussing why this is. Now, surprisingly, and I quote, he said, so to do PC current gen 2 SKUs and 2 next gen SKUs was a massive challenge. Working with the theoretical hardware would have been a disaster if, honestly, the hardest thing to deal with was not the architecture. It's actually the operating system of the systems. That's the thing that comes on the latest. The Xbox One OS on their box versus the Sony OS becomes the hardest. All the SDKs and the stuff you have to work with, that's the stuff that changes, not the hardware itself. So he further elaborated and said there's stuff on the console's OS that interacts with the game. So, for instance, voice chat is often supported by hardware manufacturers rather than the software, and you're just using their channel. When that stuff is changing because they're developing it on their side, the resources they're using are changing. From a games design standpoint, challenge is to try to make enough room for those resources to be used, but at the same time, use as much resources as possible. One of the greatest challenges engineers have to deal with is memory management or thread management. There are X number of threads in your CPU. Where in those threads is the stuff that's Microsoft's or Sony's, and where does it fall? How does it work? We don't have the SDKs with those features yet, and then they come in and you go, oh, okay, well, it needs 3 megabytes of RAM. Oh crap, we've only allocated 2. You can't just take a megabyte from somewhere. It's not like there's tons of it just laying about. You have to pull it from somewhere else, and now you have to balance that somewhere. It's a massive change internally from some of their entire engine. If they just add a few megabytes to the amount of resources they need, or they require all of their processes to be on one thread, it's not multi-thread, and then you have to put it all in one thread. Now, we could find space on one thread where that can live that's not creating a traffic jam on that thread. Sometimes we have to be like, okay, we have to move all this stuff over to a different thread and then put that into that thread just to manage traffic. That's what our engineers are often doing, managing traffic on CPU threads and memory and where that's going. Allocated memory, what kind of memory? Is it dynamic? Sometimes there has to be where we have to allocate the 3 megabytes straight off the bat and just say those 3 megabytes, specifically those actual memory addresses, have to be used for this. They can't be used for anywhere else. Whereas dynamic memory, it's like, okay, I need 3 megabytes, but it doesn't matter where those 3 megabytes come from. So all that stuff can change on the fly, and you're not trying to develop your system to match with that, and it's 2 systems now, not just one. Sony and Xbox, that creates a massive engineering nightmare. So, I hear you cry out of quote, is this the reason the Xbox One version is native 720p, being upscaled to whatever resolution you wish, for example 1080, and the PS4's is, 1080p native? Mark said, in a way. I don't know if I could point to one particular cause. Early on, we didn't know exactly the resolution of anything would fall because we didn't have the hardware or the software to support it. We tried to focus in on 1080p, and we felt that we were going to borderline a performance somewhere. We tried to make the best decision for each platform that gives you the best looking game we could get and maintains that 6 frames per second. There's no specific, oh, wait, the VO chat on the Xbox One took up so much resources that we couldn't do 1080p native. There's no definitive There's no definitive 1-to-1 per se cause and effect. It's just an overall thing. We took each system individually and said, okay, let's make the game the best we can for each system. And I think they do that great. Some people may notice that they had right next to each other, and some people may not. 1080p for the Xbox One is upscaled hardware-wise. It's a late decision too. The call wasn't even made until about a month ago. Now, the big question is, does this mean the Xbox One is not as powerful as the PS4? And you're doing your best with the hardware you have, but, well, that's pretty much all that you can do. Mark responded, it's very possible we'll get it to native 1080p. I mean, we've seen it working at native 1080p, it's just we couldn't get the frame rate in the neighborhood we wanted to be at. And it wasn't lack of effort. It wasn't that we were like last minute. We had theoretical hardware for a long time. That's the thing, you get pretty quickly and that doesn't change dramatically. It's more about resource allocation. The resource allocation is different on the consoles. That huge web of tangled resources, whether it's thread-based or it's the GPU threads or it's memory, whatever it is, optimization is something that can go on theoretically forever. I could see I could see /hope both platforms will look way better as we get a chance to play with the hardware as an obvious analogy. And if people are not sure about it, this is pretty simple. Look at Call of Duty 2 versus COD 4. It was a massive leap forward in graphics, and that's because of the time it takes to get through this. First launch, first time at bat on a new console is a challenging one. That's just the way it is. For people fearful one system is more powerful than the other, it's a long game. End quote. So, I'm sure many of you would have probably have heard all of this and thought to yourself, well, that doesn't really answer that much stuff. To be honest with you, obviously they have to be somewhat diplomatic, and I do agree that we're going to be seeing better looking titles in the future. One of the issues with utilizing a console as the specifications change is you're not really sure what resources you've got, how memory works, and so on. Now, this is a massive topic in and of itself, and the developer isn't lying. He is obviously pointing out that, this is very early stuff. They're not getting the most out of the system. The same as even the Xbox 360. A lot of titles on Xbox 360 on launch weren't running at 720p. They were actually running 600p upscaled. But less deal was made of them. I think because the PlayStation 3 at the time wasn't being released, and so there was a lot less rivalry, and so it kind of had like a clear run for the most part. The bottom line is, however, that the Xbox One has a significant amount of GPU resources which are allocated to operating system, 10%, and Microsoft are telling us that they will claw them back. I'm still unconvinced of all of the possibilities for the Xbox One's hardware because of the ESRAM. I could beat the subject to death, but we've discussed it quite a bit. And of course, I did put out that video, which is doing rather well just the other day. And honestly speaking, I think it's going to take quite a bit for them to get around this. I'm not saying they won't. I think they will. I think that developers will get around it to a degree around the memory limitations. I think that they're going to have to utilize things such as tiled resources, different rendering techniques, but ultimately, I just don't see them making up the gap between the PS4's GPU and the Xbox One's GPU. Perhaps we're missing something else. One thing that would make sense, however, is that Microsoft were telling us just a while back that one of the things that made most difference to developers was actually the increase in the clock speed of the CPU. And it's most likely because developers at that point were kind of messing around with threads and stuff, and one of the easiest ways to actually get a clock speed increase is to just simply, a performance increase is just simply sometimes to increase the clock speeds, particularly as developers right now and multi-threading tools are nowhere near to the point where they will be in 6 years' time or 4 years' time. In other words, most games right now are still not that wide. I mean, we still have a level of parallelism, but x86/64, most PC applications are like, 3 threads, maybe 4. There are even some games which are even less than that, although it's becoming more prolific now. I think one of the issues that all developers are going to have to face is they're going to have to kind of get their hands around this, and I honestly believe the PlayStation 4 is going to be the easier format to develop for. That doesn't necessarily preclude or mean that the Xbox One versions can't be terrific. I certainly think they will. I just don't really see how it can make up for the GPU deficit. I imagine that there are going to be instances where the Xbox One's hardware could possibly do things easier, maybe than the PlayStation 4. I would be surprised if it didn't have something that it did better. Simply because we don't know all of the specifications yet, so I wouldn't be surprised if there was 1 or 2 features that it did do slightly better than that of the PS4. But I think for ease of use right now in these opening stages of development, the Xbox One is just not as easy to develop for. The amount of memory bandwidth available, I mean, as I was discussing, the Xbox One's ESRAM bandwidth, a lot of developers and Microsoft are pointing out how much it is. It's 204 gigabytes, and they say 150 to 160 gigabytes is theoretically, not even theoretically, it's actual normality. So if you, put that in with the DDR3 memory bandwidth, you're getting pretty damn decent amounts of memory bandwidth. You're getting over 200. Problem is, as people keep rightly pointing out, that's nice, but the ESRAM is just not enough, and I think that right now the development tools are just not mature enough. In the end, 3 or 4 years down the line, I definitely think developers will have gotten much more used to how the ESRAM works. I think they're going to be much more familiar with the way the frame buffer works. I think they're going to be much more used to just working with the memory constraints overall. But my gut feeling is the DDR3 is going to be much more limiting in terms of memory bandwidth than the ESRAM. And ESRAM's memory pool is just not that chunky. It's just not really super large when we're dealing with like things such as anti-aliasing. Some theories I've heard include that we're going to be getting maybe 1080p on the Xbox One, but with inferior anti-aliasing. Other people have stated, well, if the polygon count / texture levels go up, then you're just going to see a correlation with the basically lower resolution. Others are stating it's going to be very difficult with the ESRAM, maintaining 60 frames per second and with everything else. And quite honestly speaking, I'm kind of in the theory mindset that we're going to be getting situations more often than not where the Xbox One does struggle more. However, despite all of this, and despite the fact that many are writing off the Xbox One in terms of hardware, and that's fine, everyone has their own theories. I personally believe the PS4, well, I would pretty much say it's a definite the PS4 is more powerful. I would have preferred it to have been pretty damn level pegging. I would have preferred, honestly speaking, I would have even preferred, maybe the developers wouldn't, but I'd have preferred even if AMD were not, the sole runners of the next generation. I would prefer maybe if NVIDIA were one and say AMD were another, whatever, it doesn't really matter. I would have preferred both systems to have been slightly more level, but regardless, parity is not necessarily a requirement or a prerequisite, if you prefer, to a close console generation. The PlayStation 2 versus, let's go with the Xbox, the original Xbox. The PS2 just got ruffle stomped when it came to the GameCube or the original Xbox. It was significantly inferior. Hardware-wise, it was a lot more difficult to get the most out of, and yet, developers got the bloody best out of the machine. I mean, I don't think anyone really expected God of War or any of those titles to run on it, and don't even, begin with titles such as The Last of Us on the PS3. In other words, superior hardware does not mean that you can't get absolutely fantastic looking experiences. It just means that from the perspective of non-exclusives, there's going to be a lot more of a danger that you're going to be getting basically the inferior port. This is especially because, well, let's just face it, the PS4's memory system and GPU and so on are certainly more open and easier to access in terms of just ease of use. That's not necessarily to say that the PS4's system is perfect. It certainly does have some issues, but I wouldn't be surprised, particularly as compute becomes more prolific and more utilized. I'm kind of curious just how the Xbox One's GPU and memory systems are going to actually start countering and dealing with that, because let's face it, the CPUs in both next-gen machines aren't exactly a major step up from what we've got. They are out-of-order processors, which are much more... they're basically a lot smarter. They can deal with random data much better. But even so, there's going to be quite a few issues, I think, for the next generation consoles. Anyway, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Sorry for being a little bit rambly. It's ridiculously late here, and I am still working. Regardless, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.